This quilt pattern was my most popular quilt pattern in 2024. It is fast. It is really easy to put together. It is a one-day quilt and it's a baby size quilt. Hi, my name is Fallon and today I'm going to be answering the two most popular questions I received in my most popular quilting tutorial from the year 2024. Those two questions were how to make this quilt pattern larger and if there is a pattern available for the quilt. Now, the easiest question to answer is the question about whether or not there is a pattern available for this quilt. At the time that I posted the tutorial, I did not have one together, but guess what? I put one together now, and I finally named this quilt pattern. It is called Patchwork Slice. The pattern will be available for purchase on my website once this video posts. In addition to the baby size quilt, there will be two additional pattern sizes available. I'm going to go through a tutorial for the small throw, but this quilt behind me is a large oversized throw, and that will be available in the pattern as well. The full tutorial for this baby sized quilt is still available on my channel, and I will link to it in the description of this video. It is such an easy quilt to put together. The concept behind it is just sewing some patchwork together. So for this size quilt, you'll need a charm pack and some accent fabric. Now, the first thing you'll do is sew the patchwork together. You'll just sew those charm squares together into an orientation where there are 7 rows and 6 blocks in each row. Once you get the patchwork together, you're just going to fold the quilt in half and you're going to slice the quilt. I know it's a little scary to think about slicing through the quilt, but you get this amazing design with not much work at all. Now, it's the same concept when bringing each of these quilt sizes together. So for this quilt, you're using the same amount of squares as the larger quilt behind me, just that quilt uses a layer cake. So keep that in mind when purchasing your fabric. All of the information will be available in the description of this video, but the only difference is with this one, you'll need more accent fabric and you'll be cutting it to a different size to get the accents here and the border. Now for this small lap size quilt, which I'll be giving the tutorial on, you'll need 2 charm packs. You won't be using 4 of the charm squares. And then you'll want the accent fabric and an optional outer border. Now for this pattern, since you have more squares, you're going to have 10 rows instead of the 7, and you're going to have 8 charm squares in each row. So it'll be 8 by 10. Let's get started on the small throw patchwork slice tutorial. So to start with, you are going to need 2 charm packs, or you could just use 85-inch squares. Then you're going to need fabric for the accent. And I already have mine cut into the 1-inch strips and 2.5-inch strips required for this pattern. And then there is an optional border if you choose to put on a border. So I have all my fabric ready and my patchwork portion is already laid out. What I like to do when I'm doing a simple patchwork is lay out all the fabric in the layout I like, and then I stack all of the rows. So this is row 1 and I mark it with a pin so that I know the start of the row, and then in order are all of my squares. And then when I get to row 2 that is stacked in order, I will come to another pin. This just keeps me nice and organized, and I can sew my rows together and bring them together nice and easily. Now I have all of row 1 here, and what I like to do is take the first block in the row and lay it to my left side and the rest of the rows to my right, so I can just sew them in order. So I'm just going to sew a 1/4-inch seam across here. I have them laying right sides together. And then for each row, I'm gonna press the seams in different directions. So for row 1, I'm gonna press the seam to my left. And when I add on the next square in the row, I'm gonna sew that 1/4 inch seam and I'm gonna press that seam to the left as well. Now when I get to row 2, I'm gonna press all the seams to the right. And since those seams are going in opposite directions, they will nest together nicely and not create a lot of bulk in your quilt. So I'm just finger pressing these seams now, but when I'm finished with the entire row, I'll press them with heat. Okay, so I have the first 2 rows sewn and pressed, so I'm gonna bring them together. And to do that, I'm gonna put row 1 on top of row 2. And then I'm gonna put them right sides together. And because we press those seams in opposite directions, they just nest together here. You can see that the seams are laying in opposite directions and you can even feel where they meet. And if we put a pin in there and sew across, we're going to get nice, perfect points there, and it'll really make the patchwork look nice and beautiful. So I like to place a pin at each of those intersections just to make sure they line up nicely. And then we have a pin in row 1 and row 2 just to mark that it was the start of the row. I leave the pin in row 1 so that I know it's the top of the quilt, but I'll take the other pin out just because it gives me less of a chance to get stabbed by a pin, honestly, the less that are there. All right, so we're just gonna sew across here. We're gonna sew a 1/4 inch seam. We're pretty much always gonna sew a 1/4 inch seam. And I'm just gonna sew across. Now when I get to each intersection where the pin is placed, I'm gonna stop sewing right when I get there, pull it out because we do not want to sew over a pin. It could break, we could mess up our machine. Bad things that can happen. So just don't sew over any of those. So I'm going to press this seam, moving it in the direction that I want. I'm pressing my seams up here. I'm going to press them up between each row. But honestly, for this pattern, it doesn't matter if you press it up or down. Just make sure you press the seam really well. So I finger pressed it, and then I'm going to press it with my iron. All right, so there's row 1 and row 2. And I'm gonna keep doing the same thing to bring the patchwork portion of this small throw together. So now we're going to get ready to slice the patchwork and then piece our sashing and border onto the quilt. So you'll want to cut 2 1-inch by length of your quilt strips. So I go ahead and measure each patchwork panel that I make and cut my strips to that length. For me, it was 46 inches. So I'm cutting 2 of these 1-inch strips to 46 inches. And then I'm also cutting 2 of these 2.5 by 46 inch strips. Now the 2.5 inch strips are my inner border for this quilt because I am adding on a outer border. So again, be sure to measure the length of your quilt because we're all going to cut our 5-inch squares a little bit differently if we're not using a charm pack, and we're all going to sew a little bit different. We may not have exact 1/4 inch seams, so the length of your quilt may be a little bit different than mine. All right, for easier cutting, when I slice this quilt top, I like to fold mine and line up the seams really well. So I'm gonna fold it in half. Now, when I'm slicing the small baby quilt or the layer cake quilt, I slice in the second column of squares, but on this size, we're going to cut in the third one in on both sides. And when I feel like it's nice and lined up at the seams, I'm gonna place a pin just so that it doesn't move around on me. Now feel all the way down, and you can feel if the seams are lined up all the way down. And honestly, just keep in mind that when you're slicing through this quilt, you may be 1/8 of an inch off in some of the blocks, but the naked eye is not going to see it. Do not dwell on that. Do not worry about it. Just have fun making your quilt. It doesn't have to be perfect. Nobody else is going to notice that. All right, so now we're going to slice the third column in right down the middle of all of them. And since this was a 4-inch square with the seam allowance, now it's 4.5. And then I have my slide lock here. I'm going to push down and it'll lock in place on the quilt so it doesn't move. Okay, so the easiest way to remember where to sew the accent strips on any of these quilt top sizes is that the thinner strips go on the center panel and the wider strips go on the smaller side panels. So I have one of my thin sashing strips here. This is just 1 inch. So I'm gonna lay that out on one side of the inner sliced panel. Do one on both sides. And the wider strip, I'm gonna sew along the thinner side. So since these are such long strips, it is smart to pin them in place. Now remember, the strips are always going to get sewn on to the side of the fabric that you just cut through. So where those rectangle patchwork pieces are now. So I'm gonna sew all these in place and press them, and then I'll show you what we do next. Okay, so we have part of the quilt here sewn together so you can see how it comes together. And over here you can see how the squares line up and the sashing strips are pressed. Now we haven't flipped this side yet, but that is how you bring it together. So flip that end piece, and then this will be how you sew it together. So you have that inner sashing that breaks up this patchwork panel a little bit. And it's really wonderful because it's a quick and easy way to make a simple patchwork quilt look a little more complicated. But the one thing with sashing strips is lining up the seams along the patchwork. You can see here that they're pretty close together. They may not be perfect. That's okay. I'm fine with perfect-ish, but I'm going to show you how I pin this to try to make sure that they are lined up pretty closely. So flip this side piece right sides together on top of the quilt. And then what you're going to want to do is fold it over, and you can see how the seams line up. And when you get it lined up straight, put a pin in. And you'll do that all the way across. Put a pin in there. It's kind of just like we did with bringing the rows together for the patchwork, but since you have that sashing strip here breaking it up, you'll need to fold it back a little to see that you're lining up the seam. All right, so I have it all pinned. Now I'm just gonna sew a 1/4 inch seam across here. All right, so I got the sashing sewn on in the first direction. So now just do the exact same steps in the other direction. You'll measure, fold it, slice, and sew the strips in place and bring it all together. If you are choosing to add a optional border onto your quilt, just go ahead and measure your quilt, trim your border strips to size, sew them on, and press and finish up your quilt. I really hope you enjoy making this quilt pattern. I think that having the PDF pattern available to you will be really helpful in remembering where to slice and feeling a little more comfortable with those steps. Now, when you do make this quilt, I hope you tag me on social media using the hashtag Patchwork Slice and the hashtag #TheRealSovietQuilt so I can see what you make. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.